Spring 1943, over Bougainville. Radio nets hiss and pop in the humid air as dawn drags a gray edge over the sea. Japanese flight leaders, men who pride themselves on recognizing an enemy by the tilt of a wingtip, log another sighting of a dark blue American fighter and shrug. Hellcat, they note, confident as ever, and push their formations toward the turning fight they've won so many times before. And then everything goes wrong. The newcomer doesn't settle into a horizontal dance. It slashes down from the sun, spits a short, blistering burst, and is gone before anyone can tighten a turn. A wingman tries to follow, dives past 250 miles an hour, and feels the controls go heavy and vague. The blue attacker angles up again, as if yanked by an invisible rope, climbing on raw power into a vertical pocket the Zero can't touch. By the time the Japanese pilots circle back, 2 aircraft trail smoke, one limping, one missing, and the net goes quiet. No boast, no tally call, just a puzzled murmur and the rattle of a damaged fuselage. They had misnamed a nightmare. The whisper spreads from briefing rooms in Rabaul to tents along dirt airstrips. Not a Hellcat at all, but something else entirely. A fighter with bent wings and a shriek in its passage. Americans call it the Corsair. Marines learn another name, pass between ground crews and infantrymen. Whistling death. Japanese pilots in early 1943 live by a simple truth. Agility wins. Outturn the enemy, channel him into a carousel, and bleed him until he makes a mistake. It's how the A6M and the Key 43 bought glory and legend. But those rules begin to crumble over Bougainville that spring. The first men to see the new blue fighter up close return with a new kind of report. Less swagger, more questions. Blue bent wings, one diary notes. Not graceful, fast in the climb, attacks from above and disappears. Others add sharper details. The American machine doesn't dogfight in circles. It refuses the invitation entirely. It arrives from altitude, hammers its target, and uses speed, not turn rate, to choose when to fight and when to vanish. Those who survive carry other shocks home. 50 caliber holes stitched along fuselages like a zipper. A canopy that will not surrender to shattering fire. Fuel tanks that do not turn a hit into a funeral pyre. Crews stare at armor glass that shrugs off punishment and scratch their heads. Pilots leave out a few lines when they retell the fight to junior men. No one wants to admit how quickly confidence gave way to panic. At first, intelligence officers misfile the threat under a familiar label. Another Grumman, another F6F variant with improved speed. The mistake holds across several weeks, even as more fragments of truth pile up. Climb angles too steep, diving passes too fierce. A silhouette that doesn't sit right with the eye. The bent wings are odd, almost awkward, like a seabird locked in mid-fold. But the results in combat are the opposite of clumsy. Aircraft fail to return. Pilots swear they radioed, then never speak again. Later, after the war, engineers leaf through recovered memos and trace the logic back to a single, uncompromising choice. The Americans built a fighter around a monster of an engine, the Pratt Whitney R-2800 double wasp, pushing more than 2,000 horsepower into a 13-foot Hamilton Standard propeller. That prop needs space. Ordinary gear legs would be too short. Make them longer, and you invite weakness, drag, and weight in the wrong places. So the design bends the wings downward from the fuselage and sweeps them up again in a sharp V. Problem solved. Ground clearance without spindly stilts. Strength without penalty. On paper, it looks like a design school oddity. In the sky, it's a revelation. The big radial hauls the Corsair up like a grappling hook thrown into the clouds. Acceleration feels less like a throttle and more like a trapdoor dropping. When a Corsair pilot rolls into a dive, gravity becomes his co-pilot. When he pulls, the airframe stays with him. When he fires, 650 caliber machine guns speak in a voice that cuts through distance and armor alike. The men who face it learn something brutal about their own assumptions. They have measured threat by weight and wing loading, by turn circles and instantaneous rate. The Corsair judges a fight by energy. How much the pilot brings into the merge, how much he keeps between engagements, how ruthlessly he trades altitude for speed, and takes it back a moment later. It is a different language entirely, and it punishes anyone who insists on translating. From a distance, the early Corsair looks almost brittle. The canopy framing, nicknamed the bird cage, splits the view into awkward panes. American pilots complain. Japanese analysts smile at the sight of thick struts and guess at a defensive handicap. They guess wrong. The Blue Fighter carries protection the Zero cannot stomach. Bullet-resistant glass that, in some configurations, nears 2 inches. An armored seat that keeps a pilot alive when heavy rounds get through. Self-sealing tanks that swell and smother flames before they swallow an airplane whole. A pilot inside this machine can take hits, keep his hands, and keep the fight. The payoff rolls down the line in 1,000 small ways. A wingman who survives to cover the break. A section leader who lives to teach a lesson. A unit that doesn't have to relearn tactics every month because the men who invented them are already dead. The awkward angles become signatures of survival. By late 1944, even the map of the war has to be redrawn around the Corsair. There is an article of faith in Japanese planning rooms. The bent-wing airplane is a land beast. It cannot land on carriers. Deck logs in the U.S. Navy tell a different story. Engineers tinker, tail hooks refined, bounce tamed, approach techniques retaught, and the accident rate drops until it sits beside the trusted Hellcat. The effect on strategy is immediate and cruel. Bases once insulated by distance find themselves under the shadow of a fighter that can lift from a deck this morning and arrive with a hate before lunch. Carrier groups no longer need to coordinate with land fields to bring the bent-wing bruiser to the party. The fleet can sail, and the Corsair will come. For planners who had counted safety in miles, this is more than inconvenient. It is a psychological strike. A captured memo from the period says it plainly. We believed the Blue Fighter could not land on ships. Now they come from the sea. There is no escape. Pilots of the F4U enter fights with a script their opponents don't expect. No baiting for a turn. No stubborn insistence on a horizontal wheel. Climb first, dive when it hurts most. Separate if the picture turns muddy. And come back when you can write the ending with your guns. Top speed around 446 miles per hour seals the margin at the top end. But the control the Corsair keeps while moving that fast is where the fear sets in. Japanese fighters often shudder above 250 miles per hour, roll authority fading just as danger peaks. Try to follow the blue blur down, and you risk your airframe. Stay high to keep your wings, and you become a turkey on a hill, watching hawks take pleasure in the slashing pass. There is a line in a post-war technical note from the Cure arsenal that catches the breath even years later. The Corsair's high-speed control makes energy tactics impossible to counter with current types. That sentence reads like a confession and a tombstone. You don't need radar to know a Corsair is coming. Men learn the tone the way sailors learn weather. A sharp rising whistle threads the sky ahead of the airplane. There are stories from Bougainville to Okinawa of how that sound changed the behavior of entire units. One infantryman says it taught him to keep his head out of daylight. Another says it taught him to count the seconds between whistle and impact like a condemned man. Pilots coin their own grim poetry for it, the sound of fate. Ground Marines hear it and grin like sinners who know the preacher is on their side. Over Okinawa, the symphony is relentless. Combat air patrols carve circles high overhead. Kamikaze groups gather for a run, tight formations of men convinced they are meteors, and the bent-wing fighters drop with terrifying orderliness. They do not simply shoot down airplanes, they scatter intent. The radio breaks into a spray of isolated voices, discipline dissolving in the wind. Some aircraft peel to survive, others cling to the plan and die in a straight line. On the beaches, men memorize how fast they can reach a foxhole from a standing start. Inside caves, the whistle echoes like a threat, pronounced in a language you suddenly understand. By the last months of 1944, the tone of Japanese Air Command briefings shifts in a way that no one can miss. The bravado hasn't vanished, but it has been contoured by loss. Internal summaries stop telling pilots to press fights against American fighters as a point of pride. New guidance, passed in quiet words and practical advice, replaces the sermon on valor with a lesson on survival. Do not engage unless the advantage is yours. Report sightings quickly. Avoid slashing attacks. Focus on bombers where possible. Live to fight on the day we choose. No proclamation declares the change. It creeps in through squadron meetings and mess tent rumors. But to the men who fly, It might as well be written on the hangar doors. There is a new king of the merge, and it wears a gull wing. Numbers never tell the whole story, but they set a boundary around disbelief. By the time official Navy and Marine Corps records close the book, Corsair pilots have claimed more than 2,140 Japanese aircraft for 189 combat losses. A kill ratio better than 11 to 1. Others do well, none do better. The ledger runs deeper than kills. It runs into the souls of men who learned on the job that their old gods were fallible. On the technical side, the Empire's engineers pay respect where their doctrine once paid scorn. Late war designs, Ki-84, Hayate, N1K2J, Shidenkai, carry thicker skin, bigger engines, heavier guns. They nod at the Corsair's formula, even as the factory schedules say the war will end before faith becomes fleet. The pivot comes too late to save the skies, but the pivot matters. It marks the moment when speed, firepower, and pilot protection cease to be luxuries and become the bare minimum price of admission to a modern fight. Imagine you are the mechanic who hated the look of it the first time you saw it. You muttered about drag and complexity and maintenance nightmares. Then your pilot comes home with a wingtip missing and a smile because the tank didn't light and the glass held and the bird still hits 300 on the numbers. You stop complaining. Picture you are the pilot who learned in a straight-wing trainer that turning is the whole game. Now you watch your leader wave you off a flat circle and pull you up into the sky instead. He teaches you how to build energy on the way out of a fight, how to dive not to escape, but to reset the board with the piece you like, how to treat altitude like money in the bank, and how to spend it without going broke. You stop insisting on the old rules. They were written for someone else's airplane. Before Bougainville, many Japanese units won by seduction. They lured the enemy into the horizontal where the zero could turn the world into a tight spiral. But the Corsair comes to the party with a different invitation. It asks for the vertical. It asks for separation. It asks the pilot to think about the fight as a series of controlled collisions separated by breath. It punishes anyone who confuses bravery with compulsion. That's what makes it more than a machine. It's a teacher. The lesson runs deeper than 6 guns and armor plate. It runs to the idea that survivability is a weapon of its own. Armor buys experience. Self-sealing tanks buy second chances. Thick glass buys a veteran core. Out of that, you build a culture. Men who can afford to learn and pass the learning down the line, instead of taking it with them into the sea. If you go back to those first months over Bougainville and watch the tape with the benefit of hindsight, you can see the dominoes lining up. Misidentification allowed complacency. Complacency put formations where gravity favored the enemy. Then came shock, then adaptation, on both sides. The Corsair's crews refined their carrier landing techniques until the old land-based only label looked like a joke. Japanese leaders shifted priorities from the duel to the mission, but the core fact didn't budge. The blue bent-wing fighter chose the terms of most engagements and made an ugly habit of winning. There's a small human story tucked in that big picture. A deck crewman on a Pacific carrier watches the first Corsairs roll aboard without bouncing into a crash barrier, and he cheers like a man who's just seen an old friend step through the door. A Marine squad leader on a black sand beach looks up at a streak in the sky and knows help. 2 minutes from now is better than help tomorrow. A young Japanese pilot, capable, brave, trained on the gospel of turn and burn, listens to a new briefing that tells him not to take fights his heroes would have chased. He stares at the floor. Morale is not only a chart in a command tent. It is a private calculus every man performs in the space between heartbeat and action. The Corsair's whistle rewired that math. If you were a Japanese infantryman, the sound meant the overhead situation had changed from maybe to definitely, and the smartest move was to get smaller. If you were a kamikaze pilot forming up for Okinawa, it meant the sky above you was mined by hunters. If you were a Marine pinned under fire, it meant your luck had a soundtrack. Whole units start to behave around a noise. That is power far beyond the number of rivets in a wing. Legends bloom around machines like this, and legends can lie. But the Corsair's legend happens to live next door to the ledger. The kill ratio is there in black ink. The survivability is there in pilot rosters that show names across campaigns instead of one theater, and done. The strategic reach is there in deck logs as square as any accountant. The shock in enemy documents, first denial, then reluctant respect, then practical caution, is a paper trail of an empire's learning curve, a channel called What If History owes at least one question to the men who bet their lives on the old rules. What if, in 1942, Japanese doctrine had pivoted to energy fighting, to vertical tactics, to heavier protection? What if the Kai-84 and Shidenkai had not only existed on drafts and limited batches, but filled squadrons with trained pilots and spare parts? What if veteran retention had been treated as the center of gravity, with armor and self-sealing tanks accepted as necessary compromises to preserve the most valuable component in an airplane, the man? The answer isn't that the Corsair would have become harmless. It is that the margin might have narrowed. Slashing attacks could have been met with disciplined brakes and vertical counters. Fast dives might have pulled into set-piece traps. Missions that turned into one-sided hunts could have stretched into knife fights with real risk on both ends. Perhaps Okinawa would still have been a graveyard, but fewer men would have heard the whistle, as prophecy and more would have heard it as a challenge to be met with speed and cunning rather than despair. Alternate history cannot rewrite a production line or swap out fuel for hope, but it can reveal how much of a war's shape is drawn by ideas about how to fight. The Corsair forced that conversation in real time. It made men compare the price of honor in a turn circle to the payoff of patience and altitude. It made commanders choose between telling pilots to be heroes and telling them to be winners. By the end of 1944, when Japanese staff officers quietly advised pilots to avoid engaging the blue bent-wing fighter unless the odds looked sweet, a kind of surrender has already happened. Not surrender of territory or flag, but surrender of the belief that courage can always outfly physics. No order announces it. No ceremony marks the day. It arrives in the way a hand hovers over a throttle and hesitates, in the way a leader tells his men to hold altitude a little longer, in the way the silence after a whistle feels heavier than it did last month. That is the Corsair's great, unsettling legacy. It did not just win fights. It closed a chapter in which lightness and bravado could beat mass and math. It opened another in which energy, protection, and firepower wrote the script, and the pilot who could read it lived to write the next line. The war moves on. Islands fall. Maps change. The Corsair keeps flying, faster than the last rumor, tougher than the last insult, colder in the way it chooses when and where to kill. Its pilots grow old in a way too many fighter jocks never do. Its sound, sharp, rising, merciless, threads through the memory of anyone who ever looked up in the Pacific and felt small. Ask the men who faced it what they remember, and they may not tell you about horsepower numbers or propeller diameter. They will tell you about that first moment in spring 1943 over Bougainville, when a blue shape dropped out of the high country and rewrote the fight before the second hand finished a lap. They will tell you about armor glass that didn't quit, tanks that didn't burn, guns that chimed like a bell tolling someone else's name. They will tell you about a day in late 1944 when the same awkward, beautiful airplane they once swore could never touch a carrier deck rolled aboard like it had been born there. They will tell you about Okinawa and a sky filled with promise and ruin. Above all, they will tell you how a machine can humble an idea. The Corsair's bent wings are still a conversation starter in museums and hangars. Visitors ask why they bend, and docents explain the giant prop, the ground clearance, the elegant logic hidden in a shape that once looked wrong. But if you stand long enough under those wings and listen past the technical applause, you can hear the sound that mattered, not the whistle, though that will always have its place, but the quiet after. The quiet of pilots who came home to tell the next class how to survive. The quiet of enemies who knew, in their bones, that the rules had changed and that no amount of heart could make an airplane into something it is not. Spring 1943, Bougainville. A misread silhouette becomes a harbinger. Late 1944, the deck welcomes what was never supposed to belong there. Okinawa, the whistle writes the schedule of fear and relief. Across those moments runs the same lesson, the one that belongs to what if and to history both. Technology chooses some of the terms. Tactics choose the rest. Courage by itself does not get a vote. Call it whistling death if you like. The name is grisly poetry, earned in smoke and steel, but the truth behind it is colder and clearer. The Corsair won because it made energy into a weapon and survivability into a strategy, because it punished the lazy assumption that the last war's victories would buy the next war's tomorrows, Because it allowed the men inside it to live long enough to pass on what worked and what didn't. It didn't just shatter airplanes, it shattered certainty. And once certainty breaks in war, everything that relies on it, doctrine, morale, the reflex to turn when you should climb, breaks with it. In the end, that's what the bent wings carried into the Pacific. Not just bullets and horsepower, but a new kind of gravity in the way the air war was fought. A gravity that pulled tactics out of superstition and into calculation. A gravity that dragged an empire's air arm from swagger to caution. A gravity that left a blueprint future fighters would follow, willingly or not. Spring 1943 began with a mislabel. It ended with a reckoning. Between the two stands a blue fighter shaped like a question and 1,000 hard answers.